Alexandra Curvelo. Here we are for a video interview for ReIReS, and with a PhD in history of art of non-band art and its circulation between Asia and America. Alexandra Curvelo is a professor of Nova University in Lisbon, researcher and board member at the Art History Institute and affiliate researcher of Center for the Humanities. She's the editor of several books, book chapters, and scientific articles. And also she was the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of Portuguese-Japanese Studies. She was co-curator of several exhibitions and scientific curator of some of them. Her research focuses on the visual and material culture of early modern Japan during the Iberian presence and on processes of cultural transfers between Asia and the Americas in the 70s and 70th centuries. So now we can start our interview. So to what extent and according to which guidelines have religious studies been developed and dealt with in museums and also in editorial publications such as school manuals over the last decades?
I can give my testimony and opinion based on my experience, of course, and as someone who worked for some years in museums. I worked at the National Art Museum and at the National Azulejo Tile Museum in Lisbon. Also, I am an art historian, and my research focuses on material and visual culture of the 16th and 17th centuries. So both the museums where I worked in are very interesting examples, because one of them is located in an ancient monastery, the National Azulejo Museum, and the National Art Museum, Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga in Lisbon, integrates the remaining space of a chapel, meaning that even in terms of space and of spatiality, religious history is part of these museums. But I would say that in my view, as far as the majority of museums are concerned, and of course I'm keeping out of this group museums associated with religious institutions, such as churches, monasteries, patriarchates, etc., I really do not think that there is the perception or the idea of associating the institution museum, its collections, and the work done by their team to the sphere of religious studies. It is important to stress that even if the museum has in its collections, as it often does, religious objects, and even though these objects are perceived as such, as religious artifacts, the approach to these objects is to relate them with the overall collection and with the history associated to which one of them. Also, I would say that as a person who worked in museums and who visits museums, that is important to have in mind that any museum object is decontextualized. And in the case of religious objects, they also have lost their primary function, as many museum objects and artifacts do. So museums are above all places that act as repositories of a heritage, aiming at preserving it and studying and, of course, exhibit the collections and communicating the collections to the public. So museums are, even more today, I would say, spaces for dialogue and institutions that act as intermediaries between heritage the memories that even the society constructs around this heritage and society itself. So in this sense, I think that museums have this fundamental role as, I would say, anchors of collective memory, as spaces of learning, and institutions that construct particular narratives. And these narratives are constructed mainly through exhibitions and exhibition catalogs. And in fact, to answer your question, in my view, and above all in the last decades, 2-3 decades, some exhibition catalogs can and are undeniable contributes to the field of religious studies. I can give you some examples that come to my mind. For instance, I can give you an example of a Portuguese exhibition and exhibition catalog that I think integrates in the field of religious studies. It was an exhibition held in the Gulbenkian Museum in Lisbon that it was titled The Image of Time. It was about European manuscript books. And it was a really interesting exhibition, and its catalog that was conceived by a wide team, but it was conceived by a religious person. It's a professor who is a priest, is clearly has this mark of religious studies. To give an example, there are thousands of examples, but of an exhibition that I saw in Rome. It was an exhibition about the Crusades. It was called, I believe, Le Crociate, l'Oriente e l'Occidente, something like this, from Urban II to St. Louis of France. It was held in the late 1990s in Rome, in Palazzo Venezia. And again, such a catalog, I believe, that can be integrated in the field of religious studies. So I don't know if you want me to develop.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answer, very articulated. And I ask you another question, like an appendix of the first question. What kind of approach do museum curators and publishers have regarding religious studies? Also, for your experience, regarding your experience.
You say curators of museums and publishers regarding these religious studies. Well, again, as I said, there are lots in terms of museums and the work done in museums. I believe that, again, there are some exhibitions and some catalog exhibitions that clearly fit or can fit in the broad sense of religious studies. Another thing is the publishers. And of course, you have nowadays many publishers around the world engage in the publication of books and, conference proceedings and so on in the field of religious studies. You even have, of course, the International Association for the study or for the history of religions, which is a very important association that gathers a lot of scholars around the world for the study of religions and religion in different perceptions. You have some journals that are specific or focused and driven by precisely history of religions. Or I would say that today you have a multiple approach to the history of religions and religious studies. And I would say that there is this trend that comes from some time now that we can label as the study of religion in a global context, and also perceiving in terms of methodology this idea of cross-studying different contexts and have plural views. also in terms of, research projects, of course. I was one of the principal investigators and had help as a co-PI of Angelo Cattaneo, that I think some of you know, of a project that was precisely titled Interactions Between Rivals, the Christian mission and Buddhist sects in Japan in the early modern age. So we could gather a group of researchers from different backgrounds, from different nationalities, with different skills, and it was really a very interesting, experience. Our book was just delivered this week, and we hope to have it published in autumn, if all goes well. So we have this multiple approach to a field that is a never-ending, really amazing and surprising field of research for those who are engaged in different chronologies as well. So I would say that ReIReS studies are in fact today one of the most dynamic fields in terms of research and study and publishing, of course.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, we are now in the building process of some kind of European citizenship, not only for the administrative or politics point of view, but for European values, that so-called European values. So what roles does the presence, distortion, or absence of religious studies play in museums and also and the publishers?
Well, that is a difficult question, I must say. Also, again, my answer comes from someone who is a Southern European, who lives in Southern Europe, and again, who is an art historian. So I really study this specific past period, early modern, and the Iberian maritime expansion. So I cannot answer this question without this background. And as such, for me, it is really, I would say, unquestionable that religion played and still plays an important role, again, in terms of collective and individual identity and memory for someone who lives in Europe and identifies itself as an European. And as such, it is important to understand the relevance of the religious dimension, namely in the building process of European reigns, of European states and nations, and ultimately of European citizenship. Although when talking about European citizenship, it is a different sphere as it aggregates so different religious and also cultural and linguistic spaces. Again, as someone who studies museums and who worked in museums, when I think about collections and I think about collecting in Europe through time or through history, we think about different collectors. The church itself was an important collector, still is, emperors, kings, and we can think for a moment about the role that some of these collections played. And I'm thinking, for instance, when we think about religion and religious studies again, about the role that relics played in Europe, both religiously, politically, economically, during, well, from late antiquity, but mainly through the Middle Ages and modern period. So when we think about relics and collecting relics that now belong to so many museum collections throughout Europe, this is a fascinating subject because they also echo the social networks that helped to build Europe. However, I would say that in my view, it is important when referring or thinking about the past, that foreign country, yes, to avoid at all costs to project today's values and today's aspiration and fears into that past. I would say that more dangerous than the absence is the distortion, as you were referring to. In my experience, both as a museum curator and as a museum visitor and as an academic, the approach to the history of religions has been a gateway to a broad understanding of its plurality. That is, how religion intersects with so many other spheres of human life, and how it was and still is a domain open to dialogue and to acceptance. But it is also a domain open to abuse, to misunderstandings, and to rejections. And again, the project in which I was engaged for so many years also taught me about this. You know, looking, not only living the present and looking what is happening around us, but also studying the past. So I would say that in broad terms, that it's what occurs me to say and to answer to your question.
In the building process of European citizenship as a natural and common expression of multicultural Europe, what are, even at a level of exclusive speculation, the aspects of a museum experience that, for you, proactively affect religious studies?
That's a very nice question, good question. And I really think that, in fact, museums can affect religious studies in at least, I would say, two different ways. Through, of course, their collections, but not only the collections, but the way objects are shown and how they are exhibited or displayed. And again, also through the narratives that museums construct around these objects. I can give you my personal experience of someone who works and visited Japan for so many times, and who has visited several museums. I'm not talking about the major Japanese museums. I'm talking about little, very unknown museums located outside the big cities of Japan and moving to southern Japan in the island of Kyushu. These are small museums associated with the presence of Christian missionaries in Japan back in the 16th and 17th centuries, and also museums that are associated with the ban of Christianity and the expulsion of missionaries, and that are associated with these objects and artifacts that belong to communities of hidden Christians that prevailed until the 19th century in Japan. Yes? So I remember visiting in different moments these museums, and it came, for me at least, with no surprise when in 2018, in June, 12 sites that are associated to the history of Japan's persecuted Christians, and all these sites are located in Kyushu, were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. These sites are considered and were considered by UNESCO to bear a unique and distinctive testimony to a cultural tradition cherished by hidden Japanese Christians around Nagasaki region, who during a period there, in fact, for a period of more than 2.5 centuries, secretly and in a clandestine way, cultivated and transmitted their faith, giving rise to a distinct religious tradition. Well, I'm talking about 12 sites, and although there is no museum on the list, for me is evident that much of the movable heritage, cultural heritage associated with this part of Japan is kept in museums around this region. And I'm thinking about, for instance, the 26 Marches Museum in Nagasaki, or the wonderful museums in Amakusa Island, or the museum in the island of Ikitsuki, in which communities of Kakure Kirishitan, that is the hidden Japanese Christians, lived since the early 17th century. So, were not for these collections and the study and understanding of this shared history, I believe that all would be different. Were not for the existence of these museums, and even the memory of this history would be lost. So the collections of these museums have been studied by scholars from different fields and from different nationalities, so with different looks about these collections, including some of the researchers of the project that already mentioned, yes? So finally, also generally, but concerning this precise event of this UNESCO 12 sites of Kyushu, Nagasaki region, in my view, these museums played their role in the process of giving this local heritage a larger global dimension, yes? And more importantly, they were places that gave to these local communities a feeling of pertaining, a feeling or giving, they give them a stable anchor of their collective memory. So, of course, that museums really actively play a role in this domain. Sure about this.
Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you very much for this opportunity as well. It was very interesting, and the questions were really interesting and demanding